Thanks so much for doing this again. And I
Yeah.
know there's a lot to cover, but the SEC is having that meeting on Monday. Not exactly sure what's going to come out of it, but I know that some of the other conferences have gone to a conference only schedule. And Brandon, I saw your article today. Do you think that that is a scenario that could work for the SEC?
Well, it's going to have to work because they're just going to have to follow in the footsteps of the Big Ten, the Pac-12, the holdouts so far. Even though this is such a quick turnaround, are the ACC, the Big 12, and the SEC. And the SEC, as you mentioned, having that meeting Monday. The ADs are actually all meeting in Birmingham. It's the first time they've met in person since they were in Nashville for the SEC basketball tournament when this pandemic began in the country. And the idea is they're going to discuss options there, but the most likely scenario is that they're going to come to terms with, hey, we need to play a conference only schedule like everybody else. My sources have told us at 24/7 Sports that that schedule will be between 8 to 10 games. And the idea is that let's play 10 games. And worst case scenario in that segment is to play 6 games, which would all be against divisional rivals, though that's far down the road when they start tweaking things depending on how this virus goes. But there's still some steps to get there. The ADs have to meet. And then, of course, the presidents are going to have to weigh in. I don't know if that'll happen on Monday, but that might end up actually happening later in the week before we actually get some official word on a potential plan moving forward. But it lines up with what Commissioner Greg Sankey has said here for the last month that late July, early August is when they're wanting to have a decision.
And here's the gloomy backdrop to it all is that Hunter Yurchek will go in, and on Saturday, Arkansas had its first 1,000 new cases of coronavirus. So that's a spike. It's not a drop. And across the South, there have been more states that have had rising numbers than falling numbers. And as much as I'd like to hope that there's going to be a full football season, it doesn't look likely. And from the people I've talked to, I don't think they're going to come out with a hard, fast decision tomorrow on what they're going to do, but they're probably going to have their options narrowed down a little bit more. And then as the next few weeks take place, they'll come out with their decision. And it is starting to look very likely that 12 is just going to be hard to reach.
Well, you guys have watched Arkansas struggle against conference games the past several years. How do you think that type of decision would impact them in that program?
Well, I mean, they've lost their last 19 conference games. And if you have to play a conference only or a conference plus one or two, your chances dwindle a little bit. The Nevada game that opens the season, that would be in jeopardy. Obviously, Notre Dame in week 2 would be. I'd like to think that they're going to be stronger on the offensive line this year, and Felipe Franks and KJ Jefferson and so on will have more time to operate, and that the run game will help balance things out a little bit more. And they'll just keep their offense on the field a little bit longer, convert on third down a little bit more, and just have chances to win games. I'm certain that they'll be more competitive, and whether that amounts to being able to beat an Ole Miss or beat a Mississippi State or a Missouri remains to be seen. But I think they'll have a little bit more backbone to them this year.
And you guys saw the Ivy League jump out there and say that they're pretty much canceling all of their fall sports this year. Do you think that they jumped the gun on that one at all?
I think the difference between the Ivy League, obviously, and the Power Five, for that matter, one, it's FCS. Two, they don't have a chance of losing as much money as, say, the FBS or even some other FCS conferences, for that matter, for canceling or postponing their fall sports, including football, which is the big moneymaker in the fall, strictly because of television deals, obviously, and the payouts that result from that. Also, these Ivy League universities, for the most part, have much larger endowments than even the biggest of the Power Five schools, other than maybe Stanford, which has quite the sizable endowment rates. But the thing is to remember with these endowments, it isn't like it's a bank account you could just dip into it anytime you want. A lot of that money is set aside for specific examples. For example, someone may have given like $5 million to be used over 20 years for the swimming program. You can't necessarily go in there and just use that for football to cover some expenses with a canceled season. So having said that, the Ivy League had less to lose. And I know a lot of people are trying to compare this to what happened in mid-March when the Ivy League came out and said, hey, we're canceling our men's and women's basketball postseason tournaments, and everybody followed after them. The fact of the matter is that a lot of people thought the Ivy League was heading that direction. It didn't really affect everybody. What really affected everybody in that real-time situation, which is a little bit different from football, where we're seeing this thing ramp up and enter the country and we didn't know much about it, was what happened in Oklahoma City in the NBA when a player tested positive right before a game. They found out and then they canceled it. And then sure enough, 24 to 48 hours later, we're discussing tournaments without fans to let's just not have tournaments. A little bit of a different scenario here. I don't think conferences are following the Ivy League's lead, but what you're seeing is that these leagues, conferences, the junior college level, for example, they're able to much easily be able to move to a spring only season. And we're seeing that now as the junior college level sets to discuss that on Monday about maybe moving their season to the spring as well.
Yeah, I think the Ivy League jumped our gun. They might not have jumped their own gun. And the SEC, it thinks for itself. I mean, it's a strong league and a lot of people follow its lead. But I agree with the idea of holding out for as long as you can. And when you get ready to implement your plan, I hope they wait until late July or maybe even the first couple of days of August before they come out with, here's what our plan is going to be. Because it's so important to our livelihoods and to just the way people conduct themselves in the South. And I guess you guys probably saw yesterday that Darren Ravel and Andy Staples had a little set to on Twitter, which, we have enough civil discord in our country that fighting over college football and the race in these states, I don't know, maybe it adds to their brands or what have you, but it was interesting to see that.
Well, something that I thought was interesting that I saw on Twitter is one of the future Razorbacks, Lucas Coley, tweeted out that he thinks that players should just be able to sign a waiver saying that they understand the risk they're taking and that football season could go on as normal. What are your thoughts on that?
Some universities came under fire, for example, especially in the Big Ten, about they were signing these promises, so to speak, and they said they weren't legally binding of, hey, this is how you need to handle yourself in this situation with the COVID-19 pandemic. And some people took that to mean, is this enforceable by law? And then they came back and said, no. I think you're entering some very murky waters there if you say, hey, we're going to have a waiver here for you to sign football, not only because of the legalities of it, but I also think that there would be a lot of student athletes out there who would sit there and pause for a second and go, I'm not signing that thing, especially when these conferences, you've seen the Big Ten say it and the Pac-12 say it when they move these conference only schedules that, hey, if you guys don't want to play a season as student athletes, you can do so and you will not lose your scholarship for the academic year and you will not be punished. Now, actions are stronger than words, but with that promise out there, there's a lot of power in the hands of the student athletes. Certainly a lot of them want to play, no matter really the circumstances we're facing right now as far as the parameters and guidelines that we're seeing. But when it comes to actually signing a piece of paper and a document that's legally binding, I think that's going to be a little tougher to do across the board for all student athletes.
Yeah, and we reported on what the U of A was doing. It was a pretty standard waiver or and acceptance of the fact that you can get hurt, you can contract illnesses, and there wasn't really any COVID-19 specific in there. But in my view, it kind of covers it in terms of the risk you undertake as a college football player. You can break your leg, you can get a concussion, all kind of things can happen, and you can get illnesses. So pretty boilerplate, I think, on theirs. And I do think that a whole lot of college football players, even though we're seeing empowerment of individual voices across the athletic spectrum, I think there's a lot of college football players that want to improve themselves this year, not want to get out of their rhythms and have a chance to get drafted in a lot of cases. So the coming weeks, the next month, are going to tell a lot about what direction we're going to go. And I would like to see college football in some form.
Just to add to that, sorry, what's so crazy, I was looking back at stories back on June 3rd, Larry Scott, the Pac-12 commissioner, was saying he was very optimistic about them playing a full season and not even having to discuss a conference only season. And here we are 1 month, and it was 7 days later. They go, we're going conference only. That's it. So I say that to say this, what's it going to look like in a month? Obviously it could be worse, but it could also be better. And if we're getting to that point, maybe we're in a conference only setting, obviously, but we're able to say, hey, it looks like we're going to start the season on time if we all kind of do our part. It's not a public, service announcement or anything like that. But I'm just saying it's amazing how quickly things have changed just month to month during this situation.
Yeah. And side note, Larry Scott apparently reported yesterday has COVID-19 symptoms. So, I was going to make the same point on this, that the timelines, the changes have happened so drastically. A month ago or 5 weeks ago, we were all so optimistic that we were going to play football. And now the needle's going in the other direction. And I think that Memorial Day around the end of May and then the 4th of July, people have gotten together. And I think we're so independent minded, especially in the South. We don't want anyone to tell us what to do. And I just want to say, I don't think the governors should put out these mandates about wearing masks, but just be smart about yourself. Wear your mask. Come out of the grocery store or any shop and wash your hands and sanitize your hands and do all those things, and we'll have a better chance of playing football.
Yeah, hopefully we see some football sometime this season. Something that a lot of people are looking at is the NBA and the MLB starting back up, and hoping that if that goes well, then that means fall sports can happen and it should be okay. But I don't know about you guys. I was wondering, do you think it's a different situation dealing with college athletes instead of professional athletes?
Oh, it's very different. For one, the NBA is in a localized situation where they're all staying pretty much in the same place in Orlando at the Walt Disney, resort. They're being watched over. They're having their meals provided to them. Whereas college football and college athletics, it's hundreds of campuses spread across the country in different hot spots. And these players are parts of the community. They're not going to go practice and they go sit in their dorm rooms isolated, all day and all night after they're done with that and they're online or in-person classwork. They got to go to the grocery store themselves. They've got to go shopping. They're going to go hang out with friends. They're going to go party. They're college students. And, if you could do a college football situation where everybody gathered, say, in Indianapolis, and they all stayed there for a few months and had a season, I think it's very, very possible you'd see a full season, but that's just not the case. We're spread out. They're amateur athletes. They have their own lives to live. This isn't their job, as much as it seems like it sometimes. It's very, very different from what the NBA is doing and even the MLB.
Yeah, vastly different, Tara. And as we've seen, I think those LSU players coming off a national championship, probably feeling very viral and strong and healthy, went to Tiger Town, and South Louisiana was a hot spot, and a lot of those guys got it, and there had to be a lot of quarantining and such. So completely different scenarios.
Well, as you guys mentioned earlier, you don't know where we're going to be a month from now, but what do you guys think is the best case scenario for college football right now?
I think it's conference only where we're heading right now with most, I think all Power 5 conferences will make that decision here in the next 2 to 3 weeks to do that. I think they'll adjust from there. There's going to be a lot of 11th hour decisions, but I think it's a good idea to start like kind of a template when you get to late July, so that when potentially preseason camps start in the 1st of August, you have an idea of what you're working toward and also who your opponents are going to be, because these conference only schedules, based off what I've been hearing, especially in the Big Ten, and I'm sure the ACC, the Pac-12, and the SEC would follow in the Big 12, is that you're going to front load your schedule with your divisional games, which are usually your bigger games, so that you make sure you get those games in. So, for example, like a Michigan, they might be playing Ohio State at the beginning of the year instead of at the end of the year, just because it's such a big game. They'll be playing their divisional opponents, which are usually spread out and at the tail end of their schedule near the beginning. Same with Alabama, same with Auburn, same with LSU. These teams are going to be in the race for the SEC title. They're going to have to be playing their divisional games earlier. And then if you look at one big game in the SEC, Alabama, Georgia, that could potentially be your season opener. but it might not be now because Georgia is a cross-divisional opponent for Alabama. That might actually be on the back end of the schedule. So look out for that. These conference-only schedules, they're going to be division-heavy at first with the crossovers in the other division near the end of the season.
Well, best case scenario, all 12. Doesn't look likely. I would tend to lean more toward what Brandon said, the conference only. And in that case, advantage teams with returning quarterbacks and a lot of veteran talent coming back. So LSU having to replace a lot of people clearly would not be favored, and they weren't anyway. But now Alabama and Auburn and some of those other teams, a little bit more favored for them to try to win it. But just hope we play some football.
Well, Tom, Brandon, thank you guys so much for your input and your insight. I just really appreciate your time.